One of the guilty pleasures my wife and I have, or rather had, is the cartoon Rick and Morty. For those who don't know, it's a show about a brilliant, though hedonistic, pleasure-seeking, and nihilistic scientist named Rick Sanchez, and his dim-witted, but generally good-hearted grandson Morty, who travel across multi-dimensional space, starting all kinds of shenanigans. Although an undoubtedly crass show with a pretty bleak, amoral worldview, Rick and Morty was pretty consistently funny in the first few seasons, particularly the pathetic beta male character of Jerry, Rick's ne'er-do-well son-in-law. However, this most recent season of Rick and Morty has gone downhill. The jokes just don't land like they used to, and has begun to take on a self-indulgent wankery spirit of sort found in pretentious art house films, only with more violence, profanity, and general debauchery. Judging by the current ratings of the show, I guess I am not the only one who's unimpressed these days. Of late, the show has also seemed to begin signaling that it's also on board with being woke to a certain extent by talking an awful lot about Nazis and the evils of racism in Season 4. In one instance, progress on a planet inhabited by sentient snakes is being held back by racial snake prejudice. In another, Jerry was called a Nazi for being misunderstood by some urban youths, and Rick kills a version of himself after being transported to another dimension where apparently the Third Reich is in charge of the world. Philosophically thinking, this is kind of interesting, since one might think the admittedly nihilistic, amoral character of Rick would not particularly care about racism and might even have a kind of admiration for the Nazi regime in a way, since he himself embodies a kind of Nietzschean will to power, is possessed of certain ubermensch qualities, and has a hatred of the world as it currently is. Not to mention, he has a willingness to endanger his Volk, his family, in pursuit of his own goals, and thinks virtually nothing of collateral damage. He openly lacks empathy for other people, is unconcerned with the troubles of the weak, and happily sacrifices those around him in pursuit of his own ends. Speaking of Nietzsche, there's quite a lot to say in this most recent episode of Rick and Morty. To briefly summarize what happens in the episode, Rick somehow impregnates a sentient planet named Gaia, obviously named Gaia. The planet consciousness sends out the word to Rick that he is the father. Rick denies being the father, but nevertheless sets about laying some serious groundwork. He starts building a city for the Gaians, which puts them on the track to being a productive, spacefaring civilization. As part of the job selection process he's created for the Gaians, the undesirables are ejected outside of the city. Meanwhile, Jerry makes contact with the unproductive outcasts and raises them into a kind of superstitious tribal Luddite faction of the Gaians. As Rick and his headstrong daughter Beth are busy adding the final touches to their enlightened civilization, his ne'er-do-well son-in-law Jerry leads the benighted Gaians in an attack against the city, and at the same time God, who is called Reggie in the show, arrives. Reggie claims that he is the true father of the Gaians and that Rick is corrupting his children. Gaia, the thought planet, admits this is the case and that she made a mistake. Reggie tries to get custody over the Gaians, but Rick resents this, being invested in his civilization building project, and rebuffs Reggie. Reggie, in his turn, inflames the superstitions of the backward tribal Gaians, and they attack the city. Beth defends the enlightened rationalist city of Gaians against the superstitious tribal Luddite Gaians, led by Jerry, and the two factions fight themselves into a stalemate. Rick and God, or Reggie, fight, and eventually Reggie, gaining the upper hand, is on the cusp of victory, tells Rick the Gaians don't need knowledge, only fear. Just before Rick's grandson Morty and his sister accidentally careen their spaceship through Reggie's head, killing him, and his body tumbles down to Earth. He crushes the Gaian city and everything Rick tried to build in all that time. Furious, Gaia banishes Rick and his family off planet, leaving the Gaians to fend for themselves. The message of the episode is fairly obvious once you peel back the ridiculous layers. Ever the avatar of reason and scientific progress, Rick Sanchez comes to a benighted planet. Those who embrace his enlightenment values are elevated, and religious troglodytes are held back by their superstition and inability to get with the program. Then science and God literally meet in battle. The forces of backward superstition meet with the forces of progress and fight to a standstill until the very icon of forward-thinking scientific progress, a spaceship, literally knocks God's head clean off. God dumb, science cool. However, the aftermath isn't necessarily pretty, and the true death of God causes untold destruction, and the inhabitants of Gaia are left to pick up the pieces. The message on the one hand is scientific triumphalism, but the episode also seems to be aware that God's death is a traumatic event, and the episode immediately brought Nietzsche's parable of the madman to mind, which I shall retell here. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the market, and cried incessantly, "I seek God, I seek God." As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. "Has he got lost?" asked one. "Did he lose his way like a child?" asked another. "Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage, emigrated?" Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. "Whither is God?" he cried. "I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What are we doing when we unchain this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns now in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? Gods, too, decompose. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe away this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whoever is born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will belong to the highest history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners, and they too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern to the ground, and it broke into pieces and went out. "I have come too early," he said to them. "My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves." It has been related further that on the same day the madman forced his way into several churches, and there struck up his Requiem Aeternam Deo. Led out and called to account, he is said always to have replied nothing but, "What, after all, are these churches now if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of God?" Ultimately, I believe there's a crumb of wisdom to be gleaned from this episode of Rick and Morty, and a bit more than that from the parable of the madman by Nietzsche. The death of God in society, metaphorically speaking, isn't something to gloat about. It just so happens that the 20th century, which dawned shortly after Nietzsche wrote The Parable of the Madman, happened to be the bloodiest in human history, in addition to being the age of peak enlightenment. The triumphalism of the new atheists of yesteryear was not only incorrect, but horribly misguided. In the end, to be freed from God means to be freed from the shackles of good and evil, and blood and tears must soon follow. Well, that's all, folks. If you've enjoyed this episode of Beyond Left and Right, I would highly encourage you to like, share, and subscribe, get the word out, and I'll talk to you next time.